everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are doing my January wrap-up, first wrap-up of the year. So in January I finished 7 books and I kind of have 2 categories that I have. Like half of them were contemporary romance and the other half were fantasy. I did realize that in 2025 I didn't read any contemporary romances, and usually every year I read a couple. Like, it's not one of my main genres, but every year I usually have some point in the year where I kind of binge, you know, 2 or 3 or more contemporary romances, and 2025 I didn't do that at all. For a while I kind of didn't know what I wanted to read in January until I hit on romance, and then I was just like, this is what I was missing, you know? I missed out on it last year and now I just need to dive in. It also is something that, you know, the beginning of 2026 has been rough. Things that obviously, especially in the United States, has been bad for a long time, but it felt like in January and just generally beginning of 2026, it has kind of reached a new height that has been tough. And like, I am not personally like anywhere near kind of the main stuff that is happening, but I also am trying to like stay engaged, stay on top of what's happening. And so I think I was also kind of leaning into some contemporary romances, not to, you know, distract myself, just to balance out. So I read 4 contemporary romances, and in February, like spoiler for February, there's going to be more romance. I have already read quite a few, but let's just get into it. I think I'm going to just kind of split this. Instead of going in order that I read them, I'm going to talk about the romances that I read first and then talk about the fantasy books that I read. So the first book that I read in 2026, I usually like to start my year off with a reread, and this was actually not the reread I was planning. My plan was that my first reread of the year was going to be Child of the Prophecy by Juliet Marillier, continuing my reread of the Seven Waters series. I like to reread it every couple of years, but I ended up deciding to kind of read that one more slowly, so I'm actually still rereading it and really savoring my reread. But my first read of the year was still a reread, and it was a 5-star, which was Coffee Boy by Austen Chant. This is, I think, the 3rd time I have read this little like contemporary romance novella, and every time I love it. And that is kind of a surprise to me, just in that I often don't enjoy novella romances because I just feel like there isn't enough time for me to get invested and feel like a real authentic connection between the characters. And yet this one, I just love it every single time. I think what works about this is that it uses one of my favorite romance tropes. And actually, I should probably tell you what this book is about, and then I'll talk about my favorite romance trope. So this is a queer contemporary romance that we are following Kieran, who has recently graduated college, and this is his first day on a new internship at a small political campaign office. And he's not looking forward to it because he is trans, and he's just not looking forward to having to kind of introduce himself to all of these new people and deal with their reactions to him. But also on the first day, he meets the campaign strategist, who is Seth. And Seth is very aloof and a little bit prickly and seems kind of standoffish, but eventually proves to be surprisingly supportive, and they eventually get to know each other and fall for each other. Okay, so the romance trope that I love, because I was like furiously Googling, trying to figure out like, can I find more books with this trope? You know, is there a name for it? And I think that what I am looking for is a starchy hero. So specifically, a starchy hero is not just like a grumpy sunshine kind of dynamic. It is that there is a character who is very like buttoned up, kind of uptight, maybe sort of aloof, and they are very focused on like following the rules and doing things right, and that type of character. But then of course, underneath all of the starchiness, they fall for their love interest. However, I do have some stipulations of like, there are some more like specific things about what makes a good like starchy hero to me. One is that the starchiness does not just make them an asshole. Like, I am not here for a like secretly a bully romance, or the kind of romance where it's like, oh, he hates everyone except the person that he's in love with. I want a starchy hero that their starchiness actually makes them a more thoughtful and caring and supportive person, that they use all of that, you know, knowing all of the rules and knowing how the system works and knowing how, you know, and their like competence to help people, to help their love interest. It makes them more thoughtful because it comes from a place of them wanting to like be good and do things right. The other thing is maybe less important, like less of a necessity, but something that makes me love them very much is when the starchy hero is also very awkward. And like, not in all scenarios. The best is when they are highly competent, kind of in their, when they're like in their element. Usually it's in a situation where they're like at work, they have this very like icy kind of aloof, competent persona, but then when they're presented with like a romantic scenario, they get very awkward, and it's just so endearing. I love the contrast of like the highly competent person and then the vulnerability of the awkwardness. And so like, I love a starchy hero, but I like a very like wholesome, thoughtful starchy hero who is also very awkward around their crush. And that is what Seth is like in this book, and that is why I love him. And I think that that is maybe why this book works so well for me, even though it's a novella, because it is a character trope that I am just like, I'm in. Like, immediately, I love this. And I really like the two of them together. Like, as I said, a starchy hero is not just like a grumpy sunshine. Honestly, Kieran is not a sunshine to Seth's grumpy. Kieran is very like cynical in some ways, but I do think that they kind of balance each other well, especially because like Seth is very uptight, Kieran is very like bold and self-expressive. Anyways, I love them. I love this novella every time I read it, and it was just such a fun way to start the year, and this was a 5-star again. Also, if you have any recommendations for a starchy hero that you think I would love, please let me know. I need more books with this trope in it. Ideally, not historical romance, because as I have been looking through, like looking for this, most of the recommendations I have found are historical romance, and I just have never really gotten into a historical romance. I tried a couple, and I just never get past the first few pages. My preference is a contemporary romance or a fantasy with a romance subplot. The next contemporary romance that I read was Once Smitten, Twice Shy by Chloe Leese. This is the third book in her Wilmot Sisters trilogy, which Chloe Leese is one of my favorite contemporary romance authors now. In 2024, I binged a ton of her books, including her whole Bergman Brothers series, which I adored. I will say her Wilmot Sisters series is not as good. And this series, each of the books is very loosely a Shakespeare retelling. Loosely to a point where sometimes it's hard to tell what they're retelling. However, this third one is probably my favorite of the trilogy, and I felt like it worked the best, but also is one of the ones that I'm like, this is really not really a retelling at this point. Our main characters are Jules and Will. Jules has been burned in the past with a previous relationship where she was not treated well, and she also has since then found out that she has a chronic illness, and so she has kind of not been dating for a while, and is very like wary to get back into the dating world. And our other main character, Will, often feels like the people that he dates don't really want a relationship with him. They don't get him. They kind of just want him physically, but not emotionally or like as a partner. And so he is looking to settle down, but is looking for somebody who will help him run the family business, but isn't necessarily looking for like a love match. And the two of them decide to help each other out and sort of practice being in a relationship and dating so that Jules can get more comfortable getting back into dating and Will can practice wooing a woman. And then of course along the way they fall in love with each other. But I feel like this is missing some key elements of a Twelfth Night retelling, one of which being that Jules is not disguising herself as a man. That's one of like the key parts of Twelfth Night. So in that way I'm kind of like, I'm not sure this even counts as a retelling anymore. But I did really have a good time with this. Chloe Leese, I feel like I just find her characters really endearing. I really love the dynamic between these two. I always appreciate the way that she incorporates representation for disabilities or chronic illness or neurodivergence in a lot of her books, and the way that that is depicted and integrated into the characters and relationships, but in a way that feels very like grounded. And although I do feel like this was maybe not the best as a retelling, I do feel like this was the best in the trilogy and was maybe the plot that was the most cohesive, and also the characters had made decisions that made more sense to me. My problems with the first two books in the trilogy were that the characters made decisions that I just was like, what are you doing? That doesn't make any sense. And so this one did not have that scenario. So I gave this one 4 stars. It was very fun. And then the other two contemporary romances that I read were Heated Rivalry and The Long Game by Rachel Reed, which of course I was inspired to read because of the TV show, which I actually have not watched the TV show because I don't have HBO Max, and I am stubborn about that I'm not going to get it just for one show, because honestly there's nothing else that I particularly want to watch on that. And I guess I could sign up for it and then cancel it, but it just doesn't feel worth it. Maybe I will get HBO Max when the second season comes out so I at least can like binge the first 2 seasons so it'll feel more worth it to me. I don't know. But I did decide to read the book because I've been watching so many edits, so many reactions, like I pretty much know what happens in the show. And I've heard from a lot of people that the book, or that the show stayed very true to the book, so it felt very worth it to like read the book. And it was such a fun time. And from what I can tell, I do think that the show stayed very true to the book, because just from like the reactions and the edits and all of that, as I was listening to the book, I was like, oh, I've seen this scene and now I understand it in context, but like this is exactly what I watched in like these edits and stuff. I gave both of the books 4 stars. These were not 5 stars for me for a couple reasons. One is that I think for my personal taste, the like smut to just other stuff ratio was not my preference. I don't have an issue with like the explicitness of it, but I do prefer to just have more other stuff going on around it. It just was like too much of the smut and the spicy scenes and not enough of the other like plot and character moments for me. Although of course the spicy scenes are very integral to the characters and their relationship development. So it's not like it's disconnected from the like emotional arc of the story. It just still was a little bit more than I like. I also prefer a little more like emotional build-up to spicy scenes, and I think that I think that's kind of the other reason this was a 4-star instead of a 5-star. This is just sort of doing some tropes that, not tropes I dislike, but they're just not favorites for me, but they are tropes that I think other people really like, so I can understand why these books are like a huge hit for other people. Not that I didn't like these. I still give them 4 stars. They were super fun. I feel like I'm making it sound like I didn't like them. But I prefer much more of like emotional buildup before they get together. This plot is much more like they get together and then they develop an emotional connection over time. And that's just not like a relationship arc that really like is my favorite. And also, I personally, I'm not that into like an enemies to lovers, hate to love, rivals to lovers. Like, that's just not a trope that does a lot for me. I don't dislike it, but it's also not one of the tropes that makes me like, I love this, I'm obsessed, you know? There are other tropes that I am obsessed with. And again, spoiler for my February wrap-up, I read the rest of the series and had a really great time. There are other books in the series that are my favorites of the series because they use tropes that I am more partial to, and also sometimes ones that other books in the series have more of that emotional build before they get together, which is just more my speed. So both of these were 4 stars. I'm really looking forward to the 3rd like Shane and Ilya book that's coming out later this year. I am for sure going to be reading it. And as I said, I mean, I obviously liked this enough that I then went and binged the rest of the series. All right, so now let's get into the fantasy books that I read. First up, we have The Merciful Crow by Margaret Owen. This is the first book in, I think the series is called The Merciful Crow duology, which is a YA fantasy series. I think this might have been her debut before she wrote Little Thieves, which that's why I was reading this, is because I read Little Thieves last year and it was one of my favorite things that I read that year. And so I wanted to try something else from this author. And I think really what I thought was most interesting about this was actually just to see how she has changed or grown as an author from her debut to her more recent work. Merciful Crow, in this we are following a character named Phi who is from the Crow class. So this takes place in a world that has a very like clear class system that is named after different birds, and the Crow class are the ones who kind of deal with the dead, especially when they have been affected by, there's like this plague, and for whatever reason the Crows are not affected by this plague, and so they are the ones who take away and deal with the bodies. But they are also very looked down upon, and they're not treated well. And so we're following Phi, who is a future chieftain of her Crow clan, when they take away what they think is the prince's body, and it turns out that the prince is not dead and he actually needs them to help smuggle him to safety. And what I found with this is that, like, Margaret Owen, I think, creates some interesting worlds, and I really enjoy her theming. This had some kind of similar themes to Little Thieves around justice, class inequality, systems of oppression, things like that. And I enjoy the themes that she does, and I think her ideas for like worlds and magic and societies are interesting, but I felt like the characterization wasn't as strong in this one as it was in Little Thieves. And I think that's what makes Little Thieves work so well, because in Little Thieves, I was so deeply invested in the characters that not only just did it keep me engaged because I was like, oh, I love them so much and I want to know what happens to them, but also I was so invested in them as individuals, in their development, in their relationships, that as events unfolded and you see like these themes coming to life within the characters' lives, it feels much more like, you know, a kick in the chest when things happen to these characters because I love them so much. And I always think that that is the best way to really get your themes across, because there are some books that keep their themes at a purely like intellectual level, and then there are books that can make you care so much for the characters that the themes come to life and you like feel it. And I felt like in The Merciful Crow, while it had like an interesting world and it had some interesting themes, it didn't have the strong characterization that made me so invested in this world and these themes. And honestly, there are two guys who are like main characters in this, and for a while I could not tell them apart. So I just felt like the characterization was not as strong, and also reading this after having read Little Thieves, it's interesting to see that I think her voice as an author was not as distinct. I think in the Little Thieves trilogy, she has a much more like unique and distinct authorial voice, whereas The Merciful Crow felt a little more generic in that way. And it wasn't bad by any means, but I just like wasn't as invested in it. I'm not sure if I'm gonna read the second book or not. It's only a duology, so I feel like I should just do it because it's like it's only one other book, but I just don't know if I'm that invested in it. And I also read Starborn by Lucy Hounsome, which is the same author as, it's Lucy Holland who wrote Sister Song. This is one of her earlier books. It is the first in a YA fantasy series. And this book I think is, honestly, speaking of generic, this felt very generic, I think. It had a lot of like very standard fantasy beats. You know, there's a young girl in a small town, but she's different, and then things start going wrong and the town turns on her, and just as this happens, of course, there are two magical strangers who whisk her away to a secret magical school where she gets bullied and then makes friends, but then we find out she's the chosen one and she has to save the world. Like it's very like standard in a lot of ways, and I don't think that it necessarily like does anything very unique with that standard formula. The writing in this I thought was fine. I think that I probably would have given this 3 stars, but then it did some things that I was not a fan of. I don't think it handled some things well. For one thing, I felt like it really didn't resolve the bullying at all, let alone in a way that made sense. I also don't feel like it had one queer character in it. I don't feel like it handled that character particularly well. The character is kind of a bad guy, and it's sort of like, because this character is queer, they were able to be like manipulated by another bad guy into like doing bad things. And it's not that queer characters can never be bad guys, but it's like, if that is the one and only queer character in the whole book, maybe that's not the best, and maybe you should include some other queer characters. And then also, I don't think it handled a character with disability, their story very well, because for a while I really liked the way that they were doing this character. This character was very competent and clearly very well respected in this place, and that the disability was not, you know, brushed under the rug. It was very much a part of the character, but didn't stop them from being this like very powerful and respected person. But then towards the end, the character's disability is cured against their will, and also framed as like the last act of love from somebody. And it's like, I don't know if it counts as an act of love if they didn't want you to do it. It just wasn't good. So in terms of general, like the reading experience of like the plot and the writing and stuff, I would give it a 3. But because of the way I feel like it kind of mishandled some other aspects of the story and characters, that would probably drag it down to more like a 2. But this is the first book that I am reading from my 2026 TBR Clear Out project. So I'm glad that I got to this. I really wanted to get to one book from that project in January. Like, I have the whole year to work my way through this list, but I kind of like to start the year on the right foot and, you know, check something off my my clear out project list right off the bat. The last book that I have is Water Moon by Samantha Sotoyambao. This is I don't know if this would be like fabulism, maybe. It is often compared to like Studio Ghibli, but in this, our main character, Hana, works with her father at a pawn shop where they will buy people's regrets, so that people can live unburdened by those regrets. And when the book starts, it is the first day that Hana is going to be in charge of the pawn shop. Her father is going to be retiring, but when she wakes up that day, her father is gone. It looks like the pawn shop has been ransacked. And then this man appears from the non-magical world and won't leave her alone. And so the two of them end up going on this adventure to find her father and discover what is going on. And along the way, we come to discover kind of the inner workings of not just the pawn shop itself, but also this kind of magical second world. And this book, I think I had kind of, the first half and the second half, I kind of had different experiences. The first half I had a lot more fun with, and then by the second half, it started to feel more repetitive and a little more like, where are we going with this? This, I think, is the kind of book that you really just have to be in it for the journey, for the vibes. Like, there is a plot. They are trying to find her father, but so much of the story is just them kind of bouncing around from different places within this magical world, and like she's explaining this world and what's going on to this man that is coming with her, and we're watching their relationship develop as they are kind of he's experiencing this world for the first time, then they are kind of running from danger and searching for her father. And the world itself is very like whimsical, but also has a really like a dark underbelly to it, and it's very like quirky, and I can definitely see the comparison to something like Studio Ghibli. And honestly, I feel like this story may have worked much better as a movie, because I think seeing this like weird whimsical world would have been really cool, and I could imagine how great that would look as a movie. But then in the second half, it just started to feel a little meandering. It kind of like, at a certain point, being in it for the vibes can only carry me so far. And so we kind of reached a point where I was like, okay, I was in it for the vibes, but now I'm a little bit like, can something happen? And also along the way, we kind of discover some things that made me start to feel like, why are we even doing this? Because I'm not sure that the father needs to be found. So I don't know, it kind of lost some momentum for me. But I ended up giving this, I think, 3.5 stars. It was fun, and I think where I landed with this author is like, not an author that I would just pick up anything that she writes, but is an author that I would keep an eye on, and if she comes out with something that particularly sounds interesting to me, I would for sure give it a shot. So those are all the books that I read in January, and I gotta say, like, I am filming this maybe like a week or so into February, and so far, February is shaping up to be a month where I'm gonna have a lot of books to talk about. For some reason, I'm reading a lot. But I would love to know how your January reading went. What was your first book of the year? Do you plan out like what your first book is going to be? But please let me know how was your January reading. Thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye.